Our next panelist is Jaki Shelton Green, who is the first African-American and third woman appointed the distinction of Poet Laureate of North Carolina. She is the 2019 Academy of American Poet Laureate Fellow, a North Carolina Literary Hall of Fame inductee, North Carolina Piedmont Laureate appointment, and the 2003 recipient of the North Carolina Award for Literature. Jaki teaches documentary poetry at Duke University Center for Documentary Studies and was appointed the 2021, Frank B. Haynes Writer in Residence at UNC Chapel Hill. Her publications include Dead on Arrival, Mask, Dead on Arrival and New Poems, Conjure Blues, Singing a Tree into Dance. Isn't that a beautiful, beautiful title? Breath of the Song, Feeding the Light, I Want to Undie You, which was also published in an English-Italian bilingual edition. And on Juneteenth, 2020, Jaki released her first LP poetry album titled The River Speaks of Thirst, produced by Soul City Sounds and Clearly Records. Jaki Shelton Green is the owner of Sister Write, providing writing retreats for women writers in Sedona, Arizona, Martha's Vineyard, Oracote, North Carolina, Northern Morocco, and Tullamore, Ireland. Len Lawson is the author of Chime and the chapbook Before the Night Wakes You. Before the Night Wakes You. He serves as co-editor of Hand in Hand, Poets Respond to Race, and The Future of Black. Among his accolades are the 2016 Jasper Artist of the Year Award in Literary Arts, the 2018 North Carolina Poetry Society, the Susan Myers Fellowship in Poetry, and several other prestigious awards. Len has received several fellowships, such as one from Tin House, and his poetry has appeared in numerous publications, including African American Review, Callaloo, Mississippi Review, Ninth Letter, First Daily, and Yemassee. In 2021, Len completes a PhD in English Literature and Criticism from Indiana University of Pennsylvania and begins as Assistant Professor of English at Newberry College. And our fourth panelist is researcher and writer Isla Shamley. Did I get that right? Good. Isla holds a PhD in Cultural Anthropology from Rice University and an MFA in Creative Writing from Queen's University in Charlotte. Her writing seeks out the intersections of culture and creativity, humanism and representation with a strong focus on home. Her works have appeared or will appear in Dilly Down Review, Anthropology Now, Our State Magazine, Orion Magazine, Entropy, and The Rumpus. This summer, she is moving to beautiful Chapel Hill, North Carolina. And finally, our fifth panelist, we would like to welcome Hannah VanderHart, who lives in Durham, North Carolina, under the pines. Hannah's poetry and essays have been published in the Boston Globe, Kenyon Review, the American Poetry Review, Agni, and elsewhere. In addition, she is the author of a poetry collection titled What Pecan Light, published by Bull City Press in 2021. And I would again like to welcome each of you. So impressed with all these wonderful works that you all have done. And I know our audience is going to be thrilled to hear you speak about your work. So let's just dive right in. I'm going to throw out a question and let's see, Jaki, how about if I start with you this time and we'll just go down the rows and anybody who wants to jump in, just jump in anytime. Ready? Okay. Our first question is, please share some of your background, like where you're from, where you grew up, who raised you, things like that.
Certainly. Thank you, Sandy.
You're welcome.
Thank you to our virtual audience for being with us this morning. I guess it's afternoon by now.
Yes.
I was born and raised in Northern Orange County in North Carolina. I actually now reside in the city of Mebane, which is where I was born, 5 miles away from where my parents lived. And actually, there's a pizzeria that used to be the Mebane Clinic. And I was born there in a time when Black people were born downstairs and white people were born upstairs. So when I'm in there and I've told them the story, they're like, oh, it's the basement, baby. So I am happy to say that I am very intentional about choosing to be in this place that has raised me, that has definitely informed my life since I was a child. I was raised by my parents, living next door to my grandmother, living next door to my mother's middle sister and her husband and another aunt and uncle 5 miles away. I attended segregated schools. I'm really dating myself now, but it's a blessing to be alive. So age does not at all phantom me. It's just a blessing to be here. It's a blessing to be here to be able to utter these stories. So that's my background. I come out of the South, come out of the complicated civil rights movement, come out of segregation, come out of being kicked out of public schools in Orange County in the 60s as a student who was an activist. I landed in a Quaker boarding school in Bucks County, Pennsylvania, because of that action. And I'm definitely from my family's inseparability to the land, because that land, the earth, the organic richness of what the land provided for us in terms of physical, spiritual, and emotional nurturance. That's where I'm from.
Well, we share a lot of the same background in history. So I'm sure we both have stories to tell that people may not even believe these days. Okay, Isla, how about you? Where did you grow up? Who raised you? And share a little of your background for us.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here. So I grew up mostly in Greensboro, North Carolina, with my mother and grandmother. So I grew up in a kind of matriarchal household. My father was living in another state. I lived in Greensboro for a really long time, so it's been fun to watch it change and evolve over the years. And I definitely feel what Jackie said about the land being a part of my upbringing. My grandmother always did a lot of gardening to take care of herself, you know, to produce some income. And as I was growing up, my mother worked full time. So I feel like I lived between this kind of generational shift in what work was looking like, and got to benefit from the working mom and the grandmother who had all of those incredible skills and resources.
Thank you. Okay, Miss Hannah, would you tell us a little bit about your background and where you were raised?
Yes, thank you. I grew up mostly in Virginia. My father was in the military though, so we did move, but we always came back to very rural Virginia. I come from a lot of farmers, and doing a lot of you know, genealogical work is where you find out that the word farmer is often code for plantation owner. My parents were both from Louisiana. They met at Louisiana Tech. So I have these deep South parents, and somehow it, you know, I didn't realize I was Southern for a really, really long time. In part because I was one of 7 children we were all homeschooled at home. My parents didn't want us in the school, probably didn't want us learning critical race theory. We had a very conservative church. Everything was kept in the church, in the home, very isolated. So it was a bit of shock actually living on a military base a couple times. But also when you do genealogy work, you see that your family has been doing a lot of the same things for years and years and years. I mean, the military is all over our family tree. The farming's all over. My father's father owns the 2nd largest chicken farm in Louisiana. We've
wow.
always kept chickens. Everyone,
Yeah.
So it's, learning to look at yourself a little bit like a stranger, and the things that are very familiar to you are very strange to others too. So that's part of my background. And now I live in North Carolina, where I just found out my family has been for a couple hundred years. My mother's side, the Giddens, are buried in Sampson County, in Giddensville.
I'm not familiar with Giddensville. What is it near?
Giddensville is very small. It's a truck stop town, which is very familiar to me.
We didn't even have a truck stop where I grew up. So,
Yeah.
Okay, Derek, how about tell us about you?
Hi, I am super excited to be here with some really, really great poets, some people I really respect, and some mentors, and just it's really beautiful. I grew up in the land of like local festivals, so the land of the Sally Chitlin Strut and the Aiken Lobster Race and the Springfield Frog Jump. So I grew up a few miles outside of the city limits of Aiken. It was a fairly undeveloped area, so that meant that I spent a lot of my childhood with my brothers playing pretend Pokemon in the woods and building shelters. My mother is from Germany, where she had lived for a few years after moving from England. And my father is from Saluda, South Carolina, where his family has lived there for several generations. So 2 very different experiences. And I kind of grew up in the middle of that. So all of that is kind of my family background. I'm also queer, non-binary, and gender fluid, living in the semi-rural South, which is something I mentioned because it's something I think that is going to inform all of my answers to all of your questions. I think I'm going to bring a really like queer notion of home and inheritance and ancestry and family to these conversations.
Yes, well, thank you. Len, and you will tell us about you now, please.
Sure. I grew up in Bamberg, South Carolina, which is a population of about 3,000. It boasted 2 traffic lights when I was growing up. I think it's diminished since then to maybe like 1.5 or something. But it's a town that I pretty much began to understand what race was. There was like there was like the shadow, I guess, of segregation there. Growing up in the 80s, I'm an 80s baby, but 90s raised me. So, I was in classes as often the only Black boy in a lot of the classrooms I was in. So that kind of informed my ideas about, I guess, hierarchy in terms of race. And my adult life has been unlearning a lot of that. So, but nature very much was a part of my childhood, and it really is part of my identity, I think, and getting back in touch with that in the many places that I've gone. I've lived in South Carolina though my whole life, so this is like an interesting panel to see like how the Carolinas have informed all of us rather than just just my experience. So excited to talk about that.
Well, I'm hearing.
Oh, by the way, I'm sorry. My family. I forgot to talk about my family.
Yes.
I grew up mostly with an older sister and my mother after my father passed away when I was 12. but my family is pretty much rooted in Bamberg and also Branchville, South Carolina. So that's pretty much where our roots are. I grew up around a lot of family reunions, so a lot of large families on both sides. So I'm used to having that type of community around me as well.
I'm hearing so many, while all of you share different backgrounds and histories, I'm hearing so many of the same things popping up, which I think is very typical of people raised in the South, where we're talking, farming, we're talking land, the importance of land and what it meant to the people living here, and chickens, and of course racial issues, which is such an alive and growing and changing, morphing every day thing that we all live with and struggle with. And I think the six of us here each have a different experience of it, for sure, but it has affected all of us in very deep and meaningful ways, and thereby the work that we do. So considering that, how do you feel that specifically that region, the region and place where you were raised, have influenced your writing, or the writing path, we might say, that you chose or that chose you? Isla, could we start with you this time?
So how have the region and place where I was raised influenced my writing? I think, as my initial description said, I am always thinking about domestic life and home life, and North Carolina has been my home for almost forever. So it's been very impactful thinking about how we go about surviving. And although work life is important, I think that there's a lot I want to pay attention to, the small things, the small traditions that families have, the small rituals that we pay attention to or cast aside because they're not serving us anymore. And I think some of this North Carolina informs me. I guess I didn't mention this before. My father immigrated from Turkey and left a lot of his culture behind. So I am deeply rooted in my mother's, life experience in a lot of ways. So I think that attention to home, as North Carolina is my home, is the primary aspect of it. And it's thinking about the things that, my grandmother making biscuits in the mornings. And my favorite thing she did was sometimes when I was little, she would take a thimble and make little tiny biscuits for me. And there was nothing more delightful than those teeny tiny biscuits. And so when I think about family and I think about love, that's the embodiment of it.
Oh, what a beautiful memory. What a beautiful memory. All right. Len, how about you? What would you say about the region and how it influenced the path that you have chosen in your writing?
Well, I think being such a rural environment and also agricultural, I think it influenced me, as well as a lot of people that aren't writers, to want to leave, to maybe escape, or like some type of flight, to see like what one could actually accomplish outside of these borders, and to see oneself not as one's parents sees them, I guess, or grandparents. So with that, trying to be a writer in this space, there's not often a lot of support, or there wasn't for me, so that there's not really also many models to go by. The closest I ever had to a model, I guess, was like Zora Neale Hurston or Toni Morrison when I was reading them in high school. So
those are some mighty good role models.
Yeah, and so to think that I could join a space with them, or even like a Maya Angelou or someone like that, was like so far beyond the little space that I was in. So, but now, you know, in the present, we have so many models and so many forms of, you know, how to be a poet and a writer, just from this panel right here. So that, you know, we're not at if I'm a young person, I'm not at a loss to say, well, there's a poet having a reading right here in my town, or, you know, somewhere I'm local, where I'm close to. So I think that was a big lack of influence on my writing life. But also, as I mentioned, like, I guess nature, specifically, I grew up where there were deer passing in the backyard, and, you know, all manner of, you know, creatures that I would collect and, you know, try to associate with. And also, I think it's important for me as a writer to reconnect with history within these states, and also history that has been lost from people that don't have or didn't have a voice, particularly African Americans. So that's something I try to get in touch with, but also more personally, just reconnecting with memories that, like Ayla was saying, that have been forgotten as I get older, but that become so vivid once I, you know, plunge myself back into that space where I'm from. I mean, I revisit Bamberg, you know, or Denmark, which is the neighboring town where my mother lives. And so a lot of those things, you know, reactivate in my mind that I think about writing about.
Okay. Derek, I'm interested to see how you crossed that divide where you were growing up, and how it influenced the path that you've taken in your writing.
Yeah, I mean, so I grew up in Aiken, South Carolina, and I didn't write about it until I was in my 20s. A lot of queer writing, you know, focuses on the city as this final destination, the place to which queer people like flee and thrive. And so that's really often the limit of queer imagination about the future in stories and poems. And as a kid, you know, I wasn't really writing queer stories, but all of the stories and poems that I wrote were set in an elsewhere, where there was like an international city, or like New York City, or some fantasy setting like Hogwarts or whatever.
Yeah.
Once I embraced writing about the South and my relationship with the South, I think my writing took on a new purpose. So, you know, there's all these queer poetic traditions from Frank O'Hara and Allen Ginsberg, but the poets that I think inform my tradition are writers like Dorothy Allison and C.A. Conrad and a whole lot of Southern queer poets, poets for whom like the landscape is not the city, but it's the field, it's the small town, it's the Bilo parking lot, it's the creek where kids are skinny dipping and you know, smoking cigarettes they stole from their parents. And I think what's really interesting is that I more and more am bringing queerness into those traditional Southern landscapes. I actually have a series of poems that's called An Ecology of Queers. And I always like to say, you know, the word ecology is a study of home. So I want to ask what a queer sense of home means and how we might imagine queer lives as possible in Southern spaces and Southern culture.
Oh, wow, that fits right in with today's panel discussion. And like Len was saying, I imagine that you too had to search really for role models as you began to write in your poetry and all, and on your path. It's interesting how we may not have a whole crowd of models and mentors, but there's always one or two that we can find and help grow that sphere as we develop and move forward. So anything else you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, definitely. I think that you would be surprised about how many queer writers are in the South. Once you start looking, they're everywhere, which I think, and queer people, it's a very diverse region.
Yeah. Okay. Hannah, how about you and the path that you chose to take with your writing?
Thank you, Sandy. So being raised in Virginia, I heard a fellow poet describe it the other day as Civil War land. And I was like, oh yeah, I never even really thought, you know, it's the things you don't think about because it's so close to you. We were always visiting battlefields. We were, I mean, there were huge cemeteries nearby, you know, and we lived near like 20 minutes out from Fredericksburg. That was the last 10 years my parents lived there. And, you know, where they still honor Confederate memorials, where they still put flags and wreaths out on, you know, Lee Jackson Day, which was only just recently converted. So that, you know, being raised in such a weirdly neo-Confederate household, which is really, I think, what it was huge. I mean, that's the uniform, you know, if we went to a Civil War museum and my parents would buy us like little gray caps, and that's what we go home and play in. So there's that aspect, but also my parents are really interested in being very close to the land. So we, you know, chickens and goats and pigs and geese, and we were really involved in 4-H and huge gardens. Like we canned all of our food. So, you know, I've written some about that, and sometimes I've had editors say like, oh, this is a great depiction of what life used to be, or from an old, and I'm like, no, this was my childhood. And, you know, I was an 80s baby and raised by the 90s, like Len said. It was so perfectly put. So, you know, this is how people still live, right? There are lots of people who still can their food. There's lots of people who still make their cheese from their goat milk, all of this. So, but for me, I think finding the author, C.D. Wright, was huge for my work. And when I read her, I was like, oh, this is who I've been missing. This is the model. Because I'd studied so many white British men that coming to a woman Southern writer, really, her work and Claudia Rankine's work is just huge in my own understanding. It's been very helpful.
All right. I'm really curious about how you felt about your education, being homeschooled all those years, and then coming out into the world. It must have been such a culture shock. I'm gathering from what you said. So we really need about 3 afternoons to talk these things through. Jaki, tell us about your background in growing up and how the region affected your chosen path.
Certainly. So when I think about the South and the rural continuity, and I must say the rural continuity, when I think about that region, I think about how my existence inside of it situated me, and especially when I was not in it. Having lived in New England and out of the country and other places, but always remembering who I am and being reminded by elders to know who you are and to always know who you come from, not where you come from, but who you come from. So the who for me was the defining factor of the where, if that makes sense at all.
Yes.
When I think about certain archetypes or certain borders of the Black body politic, those borders not necessarily being limited or restricted, but just being clear that they existed.
Mm-hmm.
And I also think about how inside of that Southernness, I learned how to claim, how to declare, how to celebrate, how even to refute the truths about the crisis of Southern memory and the fact that we're in a constant state of amnesia as Southerners many, many times. And how place for me has always been the through line, space, place, the through line of time, and how it's inherently connected to the living of the land and to ancestors. And in my upbringing in this region, I was always reminded to, first of all, as a child, I never wanted to be a writer. That was not in my psyche.
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to be an oceanographer.
Oh,
Even though
wow.
I'd never been to the ocean. I didn't know where the ocean was.
Jump.
I didn't know where the ocean but I was obsessed with Jacques Cousteau.
Oh, wow.
But when there's another question you will ask that will go deeper into that.
Okay.
But I'm reminded that there are creative makers. I didn't need role models on how to be a writer because I was surrounded by creative beings, creative makers. They didn't have business cards. They didn't have degrees. They didn't have MFAs. Most of them sometimes did not even have a high school graduation, but they were the scholars of life and helped me understand the vibrancy of the land and how I needed to respect it and ask permissions of it. And those same permissions were the permissions that have guided me deeper into an interior of what it means to have the privilege to tell, what it means to have the power to utter, the power of utterance. So, you know, when I think of region, you know, and there's another question I know you asked about, like, what is Southern? You know, I think of those symbols. And I think about how hog killing itself can just be like one whole, it could have just been this in the culture of hog killing.
Yes.
And what it meant inside of the community, what it means to not have enough. You know, looking at a South where Black and white people were definitely divided intentionally. The line was definitely on the ground across the tracks. But in times of need and in times of scarcity, those communities came together to harvest, to plant, to gather, to ensure that no one starved. And that's a semblance of community that we have lost.
Yes.
Even inside of difference, we understood our connectednesses.
Yes.
And we lived those connectednesses. And I think that we've lost that. We've certainly lost that in many, many ways.
Yes, I agree. I agree 100%. And I miss that. I miss that in this day and age. And I think it ties in well with what Isla was saying, the small, simple things that mean so much to us from our backgrounds that we have lost. And there's just this gaping hole now that we need to fill with things. And never quite sure that those things are as meaningful or as precious as what was taken. So anything else you'd like to share with us on that particular question?
No, because I find the rest of your questions to be fascinating. And I think we all have responses for those as well.
Okay, we'll move on then. All right. Let me remind the audience, please, please, please send in questions or just pop up when you hear the authors respond. Please send in your questions so we can have those for our Q&A with you all in the audience when we finish the panel discussion. I know that there are many of you out there that the ideas are just you know, bombarding you as you listen to these speakers. And I'm sitting here taking notes. It's just fascinating to me how even the vast difference of ages that we have here and experiences in life, that there is so much still that binds us, much like the thread that Jaki mentioned, the land being the thread. But I think our shared history, our shared backgrounds, as it relates to where we grew up, serves a really important purpose. Okay, Mr. Len, soon to be Dr. Lawson, I'm going to ask you to go first on this question, if you will. What kinds of intergenerational relationships have been important in your life and have shaped your work? Now, this sort of ties in a bit just the way the region affected your path, your chosen path. What about relationships? Were there specific ones that fed this hunger in you to want to express yourself and take the way that you took?
Yeah, I appreciate the question because throughout my life, I've had great relationships with elders, even those that I'm not specifically related to, but just in general, I just have had a passion to just learn from not only my grandparents and great grandparents, but just like people in my community, such as like church members or um, just prevalent people that you would see in different places, you know, like outside of a store or um, you know, just telling stories, you know, sitting on their porch or something like that. So um, I've been leaning into that a lot. But personally, my dad's mother, my grandmother Ethel, she I had a really good and close relationship with her, and she passed away maybe 5 or 6 years ago. And uh, within like the past few years, she's recently been creeping into my poems. So just the way that she lived her life, and which was, you know, very bare bones and simple. Uh, she didn't learn how to drive even until she passed away, and I would always drive her to like all her doctor's appointments and things. So um, that really sticks with me, and also like the relationship she had with my father. Um, and how they interacted with one another. That was something that was really interesting to me. But in the macro view, I would say just elders in general. And for some reason, I uh, develop relationships with people that sort of like are like outcasts of society, or like elders to me that people, you know, don't want to interact with. For example, working on a manuscript now where the center is based loosely on this individual named Brock in our city, which in Bamberg, and he would hang outside the grocery store, the local Piggly Wiggly, and you know, try to get people's groceries and, you know, get a quarter for it. And I happened to work at it at that grocery store when I was in high school, and you know, just, you know, developing like, you know, communication with him for one thing, because he had, you know, issues with his speech and like mental health as well. So individuals like that who I sort of gravitate towards to understand, you know, what the Carolinas are through their eyes, or what the world is through their eyes, is something that um, has really come out in my work, I guess, in the last few years. So I've been holding those relationships pretty dear and near to my heart.
I remember a story that you wrote when we were in the group together, and it was about your grandmother and the ironing board. Do you remember that story? It has stayed with me all these years, and so yeah, I'd say if that's the same grandmother, and I'm assuming that it is, she has played a very impressive role in influencing your writing that I know of. So yeah, fine lady. Okay, Derek, how about you?
Hi, so I'll talk really briefly about my mother first, who really brought reading into my life. That was really important to have a mom who was like from somewhere else and opened up a lot of possibilities about what else was in the world outside of the South. I still live in my hometown, but that's not because I've not ever known anything else. I've traveled, been to other countries, but you know, I choose to live here because I think that people like me didn't exist when I was growing up. I did have poets though, which was nice. Even when I was a very precocious child. So by the age of like 11, I was like friends with adult poets, and you know,
Oh,
they were kind of
wow.
nurturing me
You
into
started
something.
early.
I was very, oh yes, I was very serious as a kid. And I think it's really great. But I do wish I had like known about gay people earlier in my life as something more than a Hollywood trope or a kind of conservative boogeyman. I wish I had known that trans people even existed. You know, I didn't know the words like gender fluid or non-binary growing up, and those words give language to something that I'm like, okay, now I can understand something through language. So it wasn't really until my 20s that I got to know queer elders and meet them. Up until then, queerness kind of felt like this secret or this thing that existed somewhere else. Or something that had kind of just sprung into existence, right? But queer people have always existed. It's just that often the stories were not told, or if they were told, they were erased or destroyed or hidden. So, some of those intergenerational relationships are one-sided. They're writers that I have read and learned from. And I have a kind of affinity to those people. But some of the relationships really, I feel like they're intergenerational are really only now starting. I'm getting to meet a lot of people all across South Carolina, across North Carolina, especially, elders who, I missed out on a lot and don't know a lot. And so I'm constantly learning. And so having those people to guide me and teach me about history is really beautiful. And I think, it teaches me like it's really important to tell stories and to have that story survive for someone else.
Mhm. Absolutely. It's amazing what we do learn when we take the time to sit down and let someone else tell us their story. I regret now not making the time, more of the time, to listen. Okay, Miss Isla, where am I? No, I'm at, you've already gone or not? No, okay, Isla. Let's see. This is the intergenerational relationships, which have been, were there some that were important in your life and specifically influenced your work?
So my relationship with my grandmother definitely informed my work. I grew up, our age span was, I don't know, almost 80 years, I think. And well, gosh, I didn't do that math very well. Anyway, really big age span,
Okay.
75 years. And I spent so much time, watching soap operas with her and kind of being immersed in her life. I didn't have friends. My friends were on the soap operas with Nanny, and my activities were watching her sew. And I think because my mother was so fiercely independent and interested in professional life, a lot of what Nanny didn't feel like it was something I had access to, but I loved it. And it struck me that, I can't sew, but I can definitely animate her dresses and my words. And that's something I know I can do. My father's actually a pretty prolific writer. He's an academic. So sort of bringing together those two different worlds. And my Turkish grandmother couldn't really speak any English. And so, but she communicated her love through the sweaters she knitted and the lemonade she made. And so these very few sort of bursts of love definitely informed how I think about the care that I use when I choose words in my writing, and wanting to bring that kind of attention and elegance and love to writing is pretty important to me. But also, as an anthropologist, I studied Turkish women's work, what they did to get ready for marriages, and that they themselves didn't always feel like that work was valued. And so wanting to bring some awareness to what's been undervalued, especially among women in particular.
It's a beautiful image that you gave us when you were talking about bringing her dresses to life, and quite a beautiful image. Yes, and those crafts, those arts that our grandparents did and passed on, play such a role in many lives. There's just a lot that we can mine from those everyday, very humble activities that were also vital and important to everyday life back then. Okay, Hannah, have you already answered that? No, okay, we're going to go on to you then. So what kinds of intergenerational relationships did you have, and were they very influential on the path that you chose for your work?
Thank you. Yes, probably there are several really big influences on what Pecan Light. And the first one is with my mother, who's probably one of the most powerful personalities in my life, a very strong woman, who I admire for many reasons. But as I became an adult, we had a lot of conflict. In fact, it was the title poem, but it's just in the book. Confederate statues are falling this morning is about a fight she and I had when they pulled down the Confederate monument in front of the old Durham County Courthouse. So there's a lot of Durham poems, a lot of things with my mother. My father, I get a very gentle oral history from, like he's constantly telling me things. The other day he was saying, he was talking about a friend named Robert E. Lee. And then he said, oh, there's this other friend named Robert E. Lee. And I said, Dad, how many people named Robert E. Lee do you know? And he said, oh, 4 or 5. So the fact that, we act like things are history, we act like they're dead, but there are literal Robert E. Lees walking around. My dad, they all, it's incredible to me. Also Jack Allums, who was my 3rd great grandfather, had a plantation, who enslaved. And if you're listening and you're a white Southerner and you think you don't have any of this, you need to go look. Probably you're looking at 3rd and 4th great grandparents. But just because you do not know about it does not mean you do not have people who enslaved in your family. And I think we're told such lies. Like, we're just told, it's so glossed over. There's so many silence. We get a history of silence. You need to do that work. You need to go look, because that's part of the historical reckoning and acknowledgement you need in your writing. Is like, for white writers, that's really something you need to do.
I know for years I was embarrassed to say that my family had lived in South Carolina for hundreds of years. But during COVID, a cousin and I started doing some genealogy and family history, and we discovered that our ancestors they came here from Connecticut just after the war. So I missed that. So that made me feel better.
Well, but there are people in Connecticut who own plantations in North Carolina.
Oh, I know. No, they did not, but they were wagon makers. But
it's very interesting.
Yes. It's very just the whole dichotomy of were you, weren't you, did they, is something that I think we forget that we all carry with us here. And it is a very heavy load at times. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt your answer. Just
No. I think that's a great response, because I think that there's such a strong narrative of white innocence, and you have to fight against it. Like, it's not something, if you just sit there, it will wash over you and over you. And over.
Oh, absolutely. Not that we weren't guilty of other things, just as bad, but in relation to race. But I was thankful to learn what I learned. So very interesting. Okay, they're telling me that I'm going to run out of time, which I fully expected to do, but we're going to continue for a little while longer. I'm going to see, where am I now? Derek, you're up first this time, right? Okay. What stories or secret family stories do you have that were maybe passed on by parents? You don't have to really tell us the whole story, but give us a hint that you may be incorporating into your work, or the ideas of those stories may be coming out in your poetry and all.
Well,
Delving into the family
yeah,
closet.
I've written and published one story about my distant family.
Oh,
I don't really talk to them anymore. It did not go over very well.
okay.
We have a lot of stories that, very much, speaking on having an incredibly racist past. My family has been involved in racist violence, racism, anything you can possibly imagine. And I think there's an interesting grapple with, whether you want to engage with people who are virulently racist to change them or not to. For me, it's really no longer a choice. They don't talk to me. It's to the point where I don't feel safe talking to them either. One story I will tell you is that my father's cousin in the 80s got AIDS. And something I think was really interesting about that story is that I didn't know it until I was in my 20s. Because of course it wasn't a story that was actually told to me. When it was told to me, it was told to me as a kind of gossip. Did you know what happened to so-and-so's father? And he didn't know he had AIDS until he was dying. He gave it to his wife. He gave it to many other people in town. And I think sometimes it is the lack of stories that are told that also matter. Hannah was talking about like the white innocence, for example. You will talk to white people who will say, I've never had a racist person in my family. Well, I can't believe that's true. I mean, I think that maybe it's not talked about, but there's, that not talking, that erasure is on purpose. You know what I mean? The forgetting isn't on accident about these kind of things. And about, to bring it into queer stuff that I was going to talk about earlier, not to get too philosophical, but I think stories serve a purpose as survival manuals. When someone, way back in the day was attacked in the woods by a wolf, we said, don't go into the woods. Here's a story about someone being attacked in the woods by a wolf. The stories are about survival. You pass on a story to teach them how to survive. And so I'm really moved by stories of queer people. And a lot of those stories are also erased. You have to go to archives. They're in, zines that were released or magazines that are really poorly circulated. They're in libraries, they're in letters, they're in diaries. But I think it's really important that we find those stories, preserve those stories. There are an immense amount of queer archive initiatives happening all across the United States, and especially in the South, that are just really, really incredible. And I think it's important that we preserve those stories and tell them, because it says, yes, we exist. Yes, we've always existed and will continue to exist. And yes, in the South.
Amen. Okay. Isla, how about you? Tell us about the stories in that you might have heard passed down about your family, or just about people that live near you, and if they have been incorporated, or their influence, has been incorporated into your work some way.
So one of the, maybe not secrets, but erasures that I have become a little bit preoccupied with has been in doing some research on the Appalachian dulcimer. I had not really known anything about the Melungeons, or the possibility that people who initially populated, explorers who initially populated the Appalachian region could have come from Spain and been Jewish. And so I think that there is a story of far more diversity in North Carolina that isn't always, in the United States, really, that the stories of colonization and exploration are more multicultural, they're more varied. And the sort of big story that's being told is not the whole piece of it. And so that, for me, the story of the dulcimer is interesting because, as I said, my father's family came from Turkey. And to think, gosh, this instrument has so much to do with the instruments that were played where he grew up. And that maybe there's some songs, maybe there's some resonance that's there. So I think we can sort of deepen our understandings of our history in many different types of ways.
Interesting. Bridging the two cultures, through an instrument or music. Hannah?
Yeah, I think that probably one of the most formative stories is my mother would say our family was too poor to own slaves. And, actually not, you just can't, you start having a really good ear for when things are not true. And silence is, I think, as a Southern kid growing up. And so doing genealogy work with my grandmother and then doing genealogy work on my own, I discover fourth great grandfather, whose name was Jacob Wealthy Giddens, and who enslaved. And so being able to take what I consider really horrifying family history to my parents and my mother, who was just like, oh, wow, or, oh, well, they had wealth, or, so I think we really have to go deeper into, I think we have all these nice sounding arguments about family wealth and what does it actually mean? And like, well, it means that I'm alive in North Carolina today. And so something I ask myself in my own writing because of these stories is, can the descendant of an enslaver do any good in the world? Like, that's a hard question I ask. And you really, I think you really do need to go into history more. And some people don't have it, and why? Like, why can I find the gravestones of my enslaving grandfather, but not any of the people he enslaved? Like, they're unmarked. So that's been on my mind recently.
Oh, wow. Jackie, would you like to address this particular question?
Yes, I'm right here with everybody else in the room. So there's a story that my grandmother has told me, and she's not here anymore, but it echoes largely, and it has helped to texturize, shape, inform, direct not just my literary journey, but how I show up in my life. And I'm going to take this time and tell that story since I did not speak the last time.
Oh, I'm sorry.
My grandmother's grandmother, it's a story of my grandmother's grandmother. And we believe in our family that what we keep keeps us. So what remains? What are the things that we all have? What are the symbols? What are the artifacts? What are the heirlooms? And for many of us, those heirlooms are not tangible. But this story of my grandmother's grandmother, who was the property of the white family that owned my grandmother's grandmother, her mother, and her grandmother. My grandmother's grandmother was specifically the property of her half sister, the little white girl who was 3 years old. It was my grandmother's grandmother's duty every day to take care of this little girl, to make sure that she was properly clothed, to make sure that she was fed, but most importantly, to make sure that she had a companion. Unbeknownst to any of the adults, my grandmother's grandmother, my grandmother's grandmother's mother or her grandmother, or the white plantation owner, who was also her father and his wife, her half siblings, secretly had taught my grandmother's grandmother how to read and write. This was their secret.
Wow.
In secret. No one knew. But the white mother, who did not like this little girl for obvious reasons, had always wanted to get rid of her. And the man would not allow her to sell the child for obvious reasons. One day, the child, my grandmother's grandmother's in a room, she's 9 years old, where her half siblings are being taught how to read and write, or some lesson by the mom, the white mother, who is a very strict and stern teacher. When she called on her white child, the child had forgotten the lesson. All the children turned to my grandmother's grandmother, who was in that room. They knew she knew the answer. She was the oldest. They knew she knew. She blurted out the answer. On that day, it was discovered that this child, this enslaved child, could read and write. On that day, this child who lived in the big house, the plantation, shared a bedroom with the 3-year-old, was beat severely, thrown out of that house, sent to live at the edge of the plantation with an old enslaved woman who had outlived her service. Now the white mother has her opportunity to sell this child, which she does. My grandmother's grandmother is sold to a neighboring plantation. On the morning that the plantation owner comes to carry this child away, my grandmother's mother is running behind that old wooden buck wagon, screaming and crying that they not take her child away. An old rusty nail falls from the wagon. My grandmother's mother picks up the nail, puts it in her pocket, and keeps it. Many years later, she's able to buy her child out of slavery. That nail has been passed down on the matrilineal side of our family.
Oh,
That nail is carrying the story of the story. That nail is my story. So when I think about story, I think about how if we tell ourselves our stories, we find ourselves inside of each other's stories over and over again. So today, collectively, all of us have told stories where we find ourselves inside. There's no story today that none of us have not found ourselves inside of, situated in some way. What we keep keeps us, that nail. So the courage, the endurance, the possibilities inside of that nail. But it was my grandmother who would tell me this story. She said, your job is to tell. This is why I write. As a child who was nosy in church and was very curious and observant about everything, I was given little notebooks to be quiet in church, and I would write stories about everything happening around me. But it was my grandmother who said, you will write, you will tell these stories. Because someone who looked just like you nearly lost her life because she could read and write. The power of knowledge, but not academic knowledge always. The power of what it means to be a truth teller, the courage that it takes. So I think that all of us with these Southern backgrounds and, all of these artifacts that we've put on the table today, that we can see ourselves more clearly. When we talk about any history, Derek, you all can't tell your story without telling my story. And I can't tell my story without telling all of your story. And when Len talked about those people whose stories have been muted, erased, or usurped, those people we invisible, their stories matter too, and they are a part of a richer canon. So thank you, Sandy, for all of your guidance this morning to facilitate.
Oh, thank you for sharing that beautiful story. And I apologize that I skipped over you last time, but it was worth the wait to hear that story.
That's fine. Thank you.
Okay, who have, you're telling me I have to go now? Do we have time for one more question?
We did have an audience question, so I wasn't sure if we wanted to give our writers time to look at that question and maybe think about it for an answer. We did have one audience question.
And let's see, where is it?
It's
Oh,
in the chat from Ramona.
In
So it's a multi.
In speaking of intergenerational relationships, are you affected by children as well as older adults? What have youthful voices taught you? And what, if any, responsibility do you feel to future generations? In fact, that future thing was coming up shortly, because that's one of the things we'd like to know about, what legacy you would like to have. But would you like to address this from Ramona to all panelists? She says, were you or are you affected by the children as well as older adults? Have the youthful voices taught you something? And what, if any, responsibility do you feel toward the future generation?
Well, as a writer, as a cultural activist, and a teacher, and as the elder who's in the room now, my relationship as a child was very much seeped in respectability for elders and their presence and what they, you know, the thrones that they held, that, you know, sitting at their feet. And my responsibility as an elder is to continue to remove the gatekeepers, remove the gates that are closed to young people, to help them reframe and reimagine a different kind of world. And my job is to get out of the way.
Yes.
I mean, that's my job as an elder, is to listen, to magnify, to affirm, to guide only when I'm asked, you know, and to admit that I am not always right as the elder, you know, but to give them, to impart the wisdoms that I think I might have, that have been transmitted, passed down to me, and to be here to one, confirm that their stories are worthy. And I think that, you know, as I listen to Derek, I think a lot about, you know, how, you know, gay people have always been amongst us, you know, and I'm 68 years old, and I think back to people now who are long gone, and I realize now that they were gay, you know, but they were silenced, they were invisible. And what is my responsibility to make sure that those platforms are available? Because elders do sit in some power, you know, and we need to claim that power. And I don't buy into white privilege. On certain days of the week, I am more privileged than you are, depending on the time and the situation. That does not mean that, you know, because one is white, they don't have different advantages. But I think that we have to realize that we're all have certain entitlements that we need to step into and make sure that our future generations understand how to manifest those entitlements and those legacies of privilege. So that's my role, and that's what I do as a teacher, as an educator, and learning to be quiet.
Yes. Anyone else like to address the audience question?
I can speak.
Please.
So I think about this in part as a parent, because being a parent has really crystallized, you know, what is it about my history do I want to, you know, recreate or share, and what needs to get thrown out. And so really being sensitive to how to change, how to change all of those things that have been holding us back over time, those histories, and making a choice to reshape those dynamics. I bring students into the archives and allow them to work, you know, we invite them to work with these pieces of history and start thinking about them in really critical ways. But also on the small scale, I think about love and how different it is. My grandmother had 10 brothers and sisters, and what she experienced as love is quite different from what so many people have the resources to be able to do today. I mean, even if it's maybe just not having so many children, being able to put attention and care. And so thinking about how to shape that love and trying to bring awareness, help future generations to be self-aware. And I think right now, you know, what I hope is we can really help them to find ways to connect with each other in ways that have been taken from us.
And to start early recording their story, because their story is ultimately our story ongoing. So yes. Anyone else? Derek, anything to
I'll say
add?
something real quick. Yeah, I think so. First, as writers, I think it's our responsibility to, you know, reach out to younger writers and provide them with opportunities. I, you know, don't have a degree in English or MFA or PhD, and I'm kind of proud of that fact, and still get to be here with people who are doing PhDs, which is pretty cool. And I think a big part is saying like, hey, you know what? You guys have the power to tell your stories, and whatever you can do, wherever you can do it, you can tell those stories. I get to work with every year this mentorship program with like this art school in Charleston, and if they pair you with like a young writer. And of course, every year I get paired with like whatever trans student they have, and they're like, Derek, here you go. And I think I love that work, because I think like I'm just so proud of these people, like kids, and that they're doing stuff that for me is so terrifying. And I think that and they're doing it in, you know, South Carolina. And yeah, it's just really, really important. I mean, my entire literary education has been about people helping me get to where I want to go. And so, of course, like you want to turn around and help the next person up. I think that's really, really important, both, you know, as a writer, but also, you know, as a human being, making sure to provide those opportunities for people.
Absolutely. I'm going to have to close this out now. As much as I regret it, I'd love to spend the whole afternoon talking with you. And I'll leave you with this. I just heard this quote last night. And I can't tell you who originally said it, but the lady was telling her story, and she said her father said this to her: you spend the first 40 years of your life getting good at what you do, so you should spend the next 40 years giving it to someone else. So thank you all so much. You've been wonderful. I wish we had all afternoon to talk, and I'm sorry that I'm having to close it off, but I'm getting the evil eye here. I have to go. But thank you, ladies. It's been so much fun. Thank you again for having me as moderator and letting me share in this. It's been wonderful.
Thank you, Sandy, and thank you to everyone on the panel and everyone who's attended. We do just want to do a couple closing things quick. So as part of this series, North Carolina and South Carolina have 2 additional events scheduled for July and August, and we will be putting the registration links for those in the chat, so that we hope you'll be able to join us for those as well. And I'm going to turn it over back to Anderson to kind of give us our final closeout.
Yeah, we encourage you to follow up with each of these writers to find out more about what they're doing, purchase their books and writing, and support them any way you can. On behalf of Read SC and North Carolina Humanities Center for the Book, thank you again to our panelists, thank you to our moderator, and thank you who attended. We look forward to sharing with you again soon, and in the meantime, we hope you stay safe and be well.